Right, good morning everyone. We will make a start. We're a couple of minutes over. I can see there's still a few people coming into the webinar this morning. Firstly, I'd just like to welcome everyone to what is our second webinar as part of the Essex Health series. Really pleased to be joined by Emma from Pure Training and Development today, who's going to take us through the Dementia and Exercise webinar. Before we get started, I just wanted to run through, and I've seen a couple of bits in the questions. So we are delivering this on Zoom webinar software. So for the participants, you won't be able to see yourselves and you won't be on camera. We're going to run the sessions this morning. Emma's going to take us through her session, which will be around an hour, just over an hour. And then we'll have a sort of 20-minute Q&A session at the end. Please ask questions as we go through. On the bottom of your screen, if you're on a PC, you should have a Q&A tab. If you're on a smart device, tablet, etc., it's at the top. Please submit any questions that you have in that. And then when we get to the Q&A section, my colleagues will pose as many of the questions as we can to Emma. Any questions that don't get answered in that section, we will get answered by Emma, and we will upload the answers to our website. This webinar is being recorded, so it will be available after for viewing and sharing, which is really good. We will also ask Emma if she's happy for us to have a copy of her slides, and we can share those on the website as well. Now, just before we get started, and just to try to gauge a bit of understanding of people's knowledge and where people are at, we've got a couple of polls that we would like to run. So Mel, if you could put the first poll up for me, please. It should come up on your screen now. How would you rate your knowledge and understanding of dementia? So 1 being very poor and 5 being excellent. Once you've completed that one, you should then be able to go next and on to the second question, which will be around your knowledge and understanding of the impact of physical activity on those living with dementia. Brilliant. So just looking at the results as they're coming in, so we've got a strong percentage that are scoring themselves somewhere in the middle. So around a 3 is the highest, so 50% of people with a average knowledge, let's say, of dementia. And then for the second one, again, somewhere in the middle. So Emma, just for your knowledge, really, we've got a range of people. We've got various different partners on the call this morning as well. And yeah, so hopefully that will help. As I say, please, as we're going through, if any questions come up, please pop them in the Q&A section of the tab. Right, so that leaves me to hand over to Emma, and we'll get started with this morning's webinar.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I'm just going to share my screen in a second. I just need Active Essex to stop sharing theirs at the moment, and then I can share mine. Lovely. Brilliant. Okay, welcome. So hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining me today for this webinar. We're going to cover dementia and exercise. Thank you very much to Active Essex for inviting me to do this. It's a great topic. I'm really passionate about making sure that people understand this condition, and most importantly, how we can support people living with this condition to become active or remain active, especially into later life. So what we're going to cover some learning objectives in a minute, but just before we do, I'll just quickly introduce myself. So of course, my name is Emma. I run an organisation, a training provider called Pure Training and Development. And we specialize in training fitness professionals predominantly to work with special population groups, so older adults, people with certain medical conditions, because we're just very keen on making sure that physical activity is available to everybody and can be inclusive to everybody too. And that's sort of where my background is. I really have been an instructor for 11 years now, I think. And so I work in the field as well as training other people. And I've worked alongside of Active Essex for a few years now, delivering a health series, which has covered different chronic health conditions, including this one here, to upskill the workforce to make sure that we have an understanding of what people need to know in order to, I have no idea what that is. Sorry, not even sure if that was my end or not. In order to make sure that people can involve people in their setting, whatever their setting might be, whether you work in care and you are in a care home environment, whether you are in a fitness professional role, whether you are a sports professional, whatever it might be. We've been running the health series to make sure that you feel a little bit more confident in understanding how to support individuals with these conditions. So let's get started. I'm going to just reduce my camera so that you can see the slides fully. We're going to cover within the session, we're going to cover the pathophysiology of dementia and the different stages of the condition as it progresses. We're going to identify the benefits of physical activity and exercise in the prevention and management of the condition, discuss exercise session content and considerations, so what we need to make sure that we are addressing for safety. And whilst we talk through this particular topic, we're going to make reference to COVID-19 and the impact that it's had on both people living with dementia currently, as well as the potential development of cognitive conditions going forwards. Okay, so if you have any questions, as Simon said, then pop them in the Q&A section. I'll answer them at the end, and hopefully I can make best use of our time here today. But this is going to be a fairly quick session with the time that we have, and therefore take the time to write down anything that you feel I haven't necessarily gone over. So let's get started with understanding what dementia actually is. Now, dementia is an umbrella term, so it's not like someone has dementia and it just means one thing. There are different types of dementia. We're going to focus in today's session on the two most common types, which are Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia. So that's going to be our priority here today, but there are other types as well. The symptoms generally throughout the conditions include memory loss, difficulties with thinking, problem solving, and language. But it doesn't mean that it's a one size fits all. It definitely doesn't mean that once someone's diagnosed with a form of dementia, they will all by default have the exact same symptoms when you see them. It very much depends on the part of the brain that's been impacted and the severity of that damage too. But what we do know is dementia causes brain disease and it is a progressive condition. Now, like with all chronic health conditions, the nature and the progressive nature of a condition is very much different between people and the types of dementia. So you might have someone with very mild cognitive impairments and they have very little symptoms that really have huge impact in terms of physical activity and exercise. Perfect. But as they move through the spectrum, then they need more support. That's what we're going to talk about today. You might see more significant symptoms that can have an impact, of course. And the rate at which the disease progresses is very different depending on lifestyle factors as well as genetics. So let's have a little look here. Let's start with some statistics in the UK, just so we have an understanding of where we're at to begin with. So there's around 850,000 people estimated to be living with dementia in the UK. So that's an estimate, but it's a large number. So I just want to give some time for us to really understand that if you don't currently work with this demographic, then it's highly likely that you may well come into contact with individuals living with this condition that you can support in the near future. And I know we've got a lot of people on the webinar today that do have a dementia background as well. Of those that are, so diagnosis, the ones that are diagnosed, in the latest statistics, we've got around 525,316 to be precise, in the latest statistics, which shows you that there is a big gap in terms of those that haven't received that diagnosis yet. And in terms of projected statistics, we're looking at around 1 million people by 2025 and 2 million people by 2050 in the UK. Now, if you look at just briefly the impact that COVID's had in terms of what our statistics might look like going forwards, since February 2020, there's been a steady decline in dementia diagnosis rates in England, dropping from around 67.6% down to 63.2% in July. So we are seeing that, of course, with the changes to the healthcare system, with the changes of how GPs and practices are running at the moment, there is the potential for these diagnoses to be missed or delayed, and unfortunately people not get the same level of support in the early stages as they may well have done. So in this last year, we're undoubtedly going to see that people have missed the opportunity to get the support that they have needed at this stage, and it will be interesting, for lack of a better phrase, to see how this continues in terms of statistics and rates of diagnosis as we come out of this pandemic, because we know that the medical field and the way that the healthcare systems are going to run might well be changing for the long term, with things being done digitally. And in turn, we're also going to be looking at how we minimize the risk of this particular demographic but getting COVID. So we want to try and stop people coming into contact with the disease. And that means that remote ways of working out how to diagnose people might have to be stepped up another level. Okay, so let's have a look more specifically at the conditions that we're going to cover today, and starting with Alzheimer's disease. So Alzheimer's disease is the most common out of the dementia umbrella term, with around 520,000 people living with this condition. So initial symptoms can include things such as difficulty with word finding, difficulty remembering names and places, planning and organizing themselves. They may experience poor judgment, which affects their decision making, and they may not see or understand the views of others. So these particular symptoms, and we will talk through mild, moderate, and more severe ones shortly. These are the milder symptoms, but it's also important to highlight that someone wouldn't necessarily have all of those, and they might start with just simple misunderstanding of conversation, or it might be a case of that they just forget to turn up to appointments, and it's the subtlest of changes with symptoms that people often attribute to older age. And whilst, of course, there are memory changes that happen with aging, it's when they start to become quite significantly impactful on everyday life, and they progress at the rate that they do, that different cognitive conditions would be diagnosed. Also to highlight here, the same for all dementias, the changes that might be happening within the brain can actually start happening, say, years, if not decades, before the symptoms first present. So it's important to know that this is not something that suddenly happened to somebody. It's been a progressive disease over time. So let's have a little look at what is happening at a deeper level when people are developing Alzheimer's. So here on the left-hand side, you can see healthy neurons in the brain, in our central nervous system. And those of you that remember back to school or have a training in this area might remember these neurons and what they look like. Here we've got our dendrites, which are basically finger-like projections to the neuron that help neurons transmit messages to each other. It's almost like they hold hands and the messages travel through neuron to neuron. And we've got billions of them throughout the body. Then the messages travel down what we call the axon to the end, where that message will then be moved on to the next axon and move, and keep going through like that. So this is what happens in a healthy person's body. And what we start to see in Alzheimer's disease is the buildup of what we call plaques and tangles. So we have some proteins that start to influence and impact the way that these neurons can talk to each other. Now, plaques are a protein here we can see in blue. They're very sticky, a bit like if you picture it like, I don't know, candy floss, something like that, that's very sticky and will not move. It gets in the way of these neurons talking to each other. So the plaques start to cause a real problem. And we also have what we call tau, it's neurofibrillary tangles. And these build up within the actual neuron itself and cause problems with how it processes information. So when we get a buildup of proteins both within the neuron and around the neuron, you can see how the speed and the rate of transmission of messages is going to be slowed down, and hence we start to see that the slower speed process of people's understanding of things, communication, learning skills, and the inability to remember things. On top of these changes here with the plaques and tangles, we also see a decrease in a neurotransmitter. And neurotransmitters are needed to ensure that the neurons talk to each other quickly. They act fast and impulsively, which helps us do activities of daily living. And this neurotransmitter is called acetylcholine. In Alzheimer's, the levels of acetylcholine are diminished. They are lower, which again means that, of course, the neurons can't talk to each other as quickly as they hope to. And what we try and do, what the medical professionals try and do when appropriate, is give people drugs that stop that breakdown of acetylcholine. We want to try and keep it as high as possible. And this will help control the symptoms, stabilize the symptoms that people are living with. So there's a drug called acetylcholinesterase inhibitors that are given to clients that will help to potentially manage the severity and control their symptoms, but it is temporary and it certainly doesn't slow down the disease's progression, unfortunately. But here on this image, you can hopefully see your healthy neuron here and the axon, which sends the message over to the next neuron. And at the bottom, we've got our diseased neuron where we start seeing these plaques developing. And again, on the right-hand side, we have a healthy brain. So our cerebral cortex is the outer layer, the superficial layer that covers the whole brain. And that is changed. There's different neural changes that happen within the whole of the cerebral cortex. But actually, Alzheimer's starts in the hippocampus, which is deeper, which is lower down in the brain. So we've got the hippocampus here in a healthy brain, and then down here we can see how we have severe shrinkage of the hippocampus. Now the problem is when we've got these cells not communicating effectively, they start to die. And when they die and they die in mass, we start to see this shrinking. And that's what you can see the difference here between the healthy brain and Alzheimer's diseased brain, with shrinking in all areas. The areas of the brain that Alzheimer's moves through is different. It's outside of the scope of what we're going to cover today, but it moves around the brain. And of course, each section of your brain is responsible for different elements of what we do in everyday life. So learning, thought, memory, language, and it moves through in a progressive nature to the point that it can, of course, be fatal to people. In fact, it actually moves, if we look on this image here, from around the hippocampus area and then typically goes in a direction of sort of left, around and back. But here again, it's just another image where you can see the changes of the brain between a normal brain and an Alzheimer's diseased brain due to cell neuron death within the central nervous system. So back to those early symptoms. These are the same ones as I identified earlier. Depending on the severity of the disease, people might start to find difficulty with finding the right words that they want to use to explain things. They might forget where places are, where they keep things, or where actual places are that they go to. They might find it difficult to organize or plan themselves, hence missing appointments, turning up at the wrong time. They might find that they have poor judgment, which affects their decision making, which when we talk about physical activity, we need to be careful of for safety. And they may not be able to see or understand the views of others, which can cause miscommunication, shall we say. Now, these symptoms can progress and become more moderate symptoms, where we see increased confusion and disorientation, obsessive, repetitive, or impulsive behaviors. People may be considered to live in a different reality, so referred to as delusions. Disturbed sleep. They may start to experience problems with their speech as the cognitive changes start to impact that part of the brain. Their emotions may lead their actions, so it might appear that they have significant mood swings, and they might experience visual impairments too. As I say, not every person with mid-stage Alzheimer's disease is going to have every single one of those, and some may be more significant than others. And the speed at which people move from mild Alzheimer's symptoms through to moderate or mid stage is dependent. It can be many, many years for some individuals, and for others, it can be very quick. But what is most important is that we understand what these symptoms are and how they impact that person so that we can communicate most effectively with them and support them with what their needs are at that time in their life. If we progress further, then we see the later stages of Alzheimer's where people are finding it difficult to eat and drink. They have significantly reduced mobility, are likely to be losing weight, both due to sarcopenia, loss of muscle mass, but also if they're finding it difficult to get the nutrients into their body, then weight loss is on the horizon. There may also be incontinence issues with both urine and stool, a gradual loss of speech, and significant short and long-term memory. So we talk about the hippocampus initially, where we start the condition. The disease originates in the hippocampus, which is responsible for learning new skills and short-term memories. And that's why our initial symptoms that we see are people becoming forgetful or not remembering whether they've eaten that day or what they did earlier that day or the day before. But as we start to move through the whole of the brain in these later stages, we can see both an impact in the short-term memory as well as the long-term memory. So that is an overview quickly of what Alzheimer's is in terms of its pathophysiology, but how is COVID, or how has COVID been affecting people living with dementia, in particular Alzheimer's? So there's some research that's looking into this. As we know, all chronic conditions are being impacted by COVID-19 currently. It's going to be something that continues to have an impact as well. But since the beginning of lockdown, those living with Alzheimer's disease have reported difficulty, more significant difficulty in concentrating and memory loss compared to prior to lockdown. And it's not unreasonable to understand that at all. Let me just turn my camera back on. We've got people that have had very little contact with other individuals. If it's particularly in a care environment, people in care will not have seen loved ones for a very long period of time, and therefore missing out on that stimulus. The ability to get out and about and do everyday routines has not been there, and routine is a huge thing that is needed for people living with this condition. Routine of going to places, whether that's groups, appointments, seeing people, going for walks, it is needed in order to stabilize the condition. And with COVID, that's been a significant impact. And then alongside that, you have the decrease in environmental stimuli, going outside, seeing different changes to light, seeing different environments, speaking to different people, and just generally missing that interaction. And it has a huge impact on how the brain works. So whilst there have been things that carers have done and significant others that are caring for people have done in terms of looking after their well-being with puzzles, cognitive stimulation like that, exercise at home, which has been great, not everyone's had access to that. And those that haven't are going to see even greater impact. Now, as we go through this training, I just want to highlight at points the impact on both those currently living with the condition, but also the potential risk that there could be for individuals that have had COVID later down the line. And if you joined in the last webinar where we were joined by Dr. William Bird and Ruth Barlow, they were both talking about how COVID can affect the body in terms of inflammation and recovery. So Dr. William Bird was talking about how inflammation comes from chronic stress, and COVID-19 has been a very challenging time for everybody, particularly for individuals that really can't comprehend quite what is happening in this world at the moment. Couple chronic stress with inactivity and maybe different forms of eating, we get an increased amount of inflammation in the body, and then your immune system causes that inflammation to be a negative thing, and it causes damage. So what we want to make sure we do is help and engage as many people as possible, even if it's within their homes currently, to become active, because it can help to reduce that level of inflammation. Physical activity can support that, and we really want to make that a priority. And then we had Ruth, who was talking about those that are living with COVID-19 or had it and are recovering from it and might be experiencing those long COVID symptoms. They can include issues with memory, brain fog, not being able to really concentrate on tasks the same way as they did before. And I'll talk a little bit later about some of the research that's looking into the impact that COVID and just viruses like this can have on the actual body long term, which could cause for increased diagnosis rates of different cognitive conditions. So let me move on now to vascular dementia, which is our second most common type of dementia. So again, Alzheimer's disease was neural. It was affecting the neurons within the body. Vascular dementia refers to just that, the vascular system, and that is our blood network. So when people are experiencing vascular dementia, it's because they aren't receiving oxygenated blood and nutrients to the brain. So it's a blood vessel disease as opposed to a neurological condition. So this lack of oxygenated blood can cause various cognitive issues. Some are very similar to what we talked about in Alzheimer's, whereas others are different. Now, it's still a very prevalent condition, but it affects approximately 150,000 people in the UK currently. There are two types of vascular dementia: subcortical dementia, which is the most common type, and then stroke-related dementia. Now, subcortical dementia is when the vessels deep in the brain, so underneath the cerebral cortex, like deep in the brain, become hard, stiff, twisted. Buildup of atherosclerosis, so fatty plaque within them, means that the oxygenated blood that needs to supply the brain isn't being delivered as it should. And so the more significant impact the disease has, the greater the impact overall in terms of reduced oxygen supply to the brain, and in turn we will see those symptoms. So if it's a small change or small amount of damage initially, then we see the milder symptoms. And if there's more significant developments to those vessels deep in the brain, then of course we start to see the more moderate or severe symptoms. So subcortical dementia, it doesn't occur for any one particular reason, but it can be linked to a poorer lifestyle, so inactivity, inflammation again, and also bad nutritional choices, along with stress and just many other things that build into an unhealthy lifestyle. Whereas stroke-related dementia is, as it says, it relates to infarcts, so either blockages or small bleeds within the vessels of the brain. Now, we can have mini strokes, which are called transient ischemic attacks, and they can cause minor damage within an area of the brain. Depending on what area of the brain that infarct or bleed has occurred in, will then impact the symptoms that someone experiences. So that's why you can see differences in symptoms with people with vascular dementia, because it doesn't just happen in one set area of the brain. So with mini strokes or TIAs, people might have one or they might have multiple. And with multiple, we're going to get more and more symptoms of vascular dementia. And then people might have a full stroke, a complete blockage or a full bleed on the brain. And of course, that's going to cause damage and kill off a lot of neurons in one area of the brain, which will then provide, or it describe, should I say, the symptoms that that person would experience. So it's very much location dependent, but once this disease sets in, it's a very high chance, there's a very high chance of it progressing and around the brain to cause different symptoms. So these early stages of vascular dementia start with slowness of thought. That's the difference. Rather than forgetting things in Alzheimer's, it's slowness of thought. And difficulty with planning, trouble with language and communicating what they want to communicate. Definite problems with attention and concentration, which we'll talk about with regards to physical activity and exercise. And again, of course, you might see those behavioural changes in an individual. Once again, just re-highlighting that it's not a case that all of these things are going to happen to one individual person. But if we move to the more advanced stages of vascular dementia, we can see that it does get worse. All of them we talked about being progressive, but with vascular dementia, it can get worse in sudden stages. So it's important to highlight that that form, in terms of getting worse in stages, is related to that stroke related dementia, because of course with a stroke you have a sudden change to the brain tissue and therefore subsequent symptoms, whereas with subcortical vascular dementia it's generally a more gradual and progressive decline over the years. But all of these symptoms are dependent on the area of the brain, as I keep saying. Memory loss, difficulty concentrating, difficulty finding words, personality changes. Then we might see emotions leading actions, so very much less rational, thought out reasons of communicating or ways of communicating with people, and more they just do what they feel. Depression, hallucinations, and finding it difficult to walk and keep balance, and therefore the greater risk of falls. So this is the more advanced stages, and of course we need to be mindful of how we would keep people safe and run sessions that would be effective for those living with this stage of the disease. I think there's many great resources out there from the Alzheimer's and different dementia charities, but you can also get access to these books that show you what people might see who are living with dementia compared to what we see. For example, a shiny black floor in an entrance to a building might look like a gaping hole to somebody, or wallpaper patterns down the wall might look like snakes. Things like that, where we wouldn't associate that with anything distressing, might cause distressed reactions to an individual, and it's trying to understand and appreciate that so that you can support them in a range of environments. So if we just then touch upon how is COVID impacting cognition for everyone, not necessarily just those with dementia. But there are different studies going on. As you can see, it's pretty recent stuff, and I'll just read this one out. COVID-19 and its effects on cognitive function are being researched as data from previous severe acute respiratory epidemics have identified memory impairments following initial exposure. There is the potential risk that COVID-19 infection may cause long-term cognitive decline by accelerating the onset of neurodegenerative dementia. So I think it's important that we understand what these signs and symptoms are and know how we can work with individuals that are currently living with dementia, appreciating what they've currently been through and how that is likely to almost have exacerbated their symptoms, but also appreciate that individuals without a diagnosed cognitive condition might be experiencing very similar symptoms, and we need to adapt accordingly. And in the future, we might see maybe younger individuals experiencing dementia-like symptoms as a result of having COVID-19, and not even necessarily severe cases of COVID-19. There's been some evidence to suggest that even milder symptoms of the condition that weren't hospitalized, but still ended up having real issues with their ability to process information. So the increasing evidence and understanding of SARS-CoV-2 impact on the central nervous system raises key questions on the impact for risk in later life cognitive decline. I think this is going to be a field to look out in. Of course, this is still new and very much it's not set, it's not a case of, oh, everyone's going to experience this. Of course it's not, but this is something that we do very much need to keep front of mind, particularly if we work with the older demographic as well, and they've had COVID. Okay, so try to get through that in a fairly time efficient way in terms of those two conditions, but do let me know if you have any questions related to them. And as I said before, Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia are not the only two types, but they are two of the most prevalent types of dementia that we're covering today. And the fact that people have gone so long without social engagement and without that routine that they so very much need in order to control their symptoms is going to cause a lot of agitation and restlessness. And hopefully, if we can engage them back into physical activity, we can help them control that. So we're going to have a little look here, not going into huge amounts of details again for time, but we want to have a look at how exercise and physical activity can prevent, but most importantly here, manage this particular condition. So let me just, I'll just turn my camera back on. Okay, lovely. So Starting off with just identifying how we can potentially prevent the risk. Now, there's been quite a lot of research, but like with all research, it can be inconsistent at times, because getting the same sort of study, same sample size, the same goal between different literature is very challenging. But if people lead a healthy, active lifestyle, they eat well, they sleep well, they control their stress, and they move, then the movement element can really reduce the risk of dementia. And in some studies, it can reduce the risk of up to 30% for dementia overall and 45% for Alzheimer's disease. So movement is going to be key for anyone that you know, yourselves, just trying to get everybody moving. And there's also a fantastic TED talk by a lady who was she's a neuroscientist, looking at how the brain responds to exercise, and talked about how important it is to just get moving. Even one episode of exercise, so like one walk, one exercise class, one chair-based exercise routine, whatever it might be, can really help improve the brain's cognition and potentially reduce any further, sort of promotes the time at which healthy neurons function, so pushes away, delays the potential diagnosis of cognitive conditions. So it's suggested to delay the onset. It's not, of course, a miracle drug in terms of it can absolutely stop, but it could delay the onset, particularly for those at risk. So that's sort of the two key things that I'm going to just highlight there for prevention. But then when we're talking about individuals that are living with the condition currently, of course, activity is going to help improve cognition, because it improves cerebral blood flow. The greater amount of oxygen and nutrients we can get to the brain and stimulate the brain through the forms of activity, whether that's coordination, etc., is going to help improve cognition and thought. And I'll touch upon that again shortly. It was also seen and more recently being researched to boost the immune system and reduce that inflammation. So again, referring back to that first webinar, if you didn't see it, there is a recording that Active Essex have provided where they were talking about how inflammation really can cause the development of various chronic health conditions, but can also exacerbate symptoms and put people at risk of ill health. And what exercise can do is calm that down. And Dr. William Bird was saying that even 1 hour of brisk walking outside can really help reduce many variables that influence inflammation. And also he talked about green exercise and exercising outside and how that is an anti-aging drug. So boosting the immune system is going to be an important one, but it has to be done in a safe and sensible way in terms of risks. So of course, you've got to identify that relating to COVID. It is going to prevent muscle weakness, it's going to prevent mobility problems, and it's going to help prevent other chronic health conditions from developing. And I think this is key for everybody, isn't it? But particularly those that already are concerned about losing their quality of life or having a diminished quality of life, losing their independence and ability to do what it is that they like to do and feel that we all want to be able to look after ourselves for as long as possible. And physical activity and exercise helps us to work towards that goal. COVID has caused severe deconditioning in probably nearly everybody that wasn't able to access the same interventions or same classes, whatever it might have been, as they were beforehand. And this severe deconditioning is going to be a real problem and something that we need to think about when we start returning back to physical activity, if we're not already, starting to focus on mobility first, strength, and then build up the cardiovascular exercise so that we do it safely. But anyway, the focus needs to be that we do keep things functional so that we can target these areas. And with exercise, what I love about exercise is that even though we might have exercise in mind or physical activity even, as what I want to help support this person to remain active, and I'm focused on the fact that they are living with dementia. But in turn, I'm also going to strengthen the cardiorespiratory system. I'm going to control the metabolism. I'm going to help manage all to keep all other chronic health conditions like type 2 diabetes and heart disease at bay for as long as possible too, even though that isn't my initial goal. So it's fantastic at preventing those comorbidities from developing. So with reduced muscle movement, mobility, I said we have diminished activities of daily living. So if we can maintain them, then we're improving those activities of daily living. Even simple things like being able to put your own socks on, comb your own hair, be able to reach up to a top shelf. It's all really important, and we need to make sure that we control. We help them control those elements of their daily life as much as we possibly can. Another fantastic benefit of activity is it promotes a routine, as I said before, and routine is so important, particularly day and night routine for those with the more moderate to severe stages of dementia. It helps, but if they're still all the time and there's very little happening, i.e. COVID restrictions, then that routine has been lost, and then that can cause further cognitive decline. And of course, we need to make sure that exercise is social. It's as much about the person leading the exercise as it is the people in the room and the exercise itself. If there's no social element, if it's not structured around something people enjoy and can achieve, then it won't be done, it won't be engaged in, and it won't be adhered to for as long. So social interaction is, of course, by far going to be one of the biggest focuses for making sure that we create long-term exercise choices. We need to focus, and exercise can support reducing the risk of falls, as I said, improving cardiovascular health, improving the strength, flexibility, and endurance to help with those activities of daily living. Definitely improve sleep. There's a lot of research that shows that activity can help improve sleep for everybody. Particularly those with, say, sleep apnea and cognitive conditions that struggle to sleep. And again, Ruth in her previous training was talking from sort of a nursing background that sleep can actually, without sleep, so many other things can happen in the body and we don't function very well. And so sleep is so important for brain and cognitive function. And we want to ensure that we get people to optimize that sleep as much as we physically can within, obviously, our roles. So we're looking to maintain that independence and improve confidence and self-esteem for this demographic. And I do honestly think, from my experience, and I'm sure a lot of you, if you have an exercise background or any experience in that activity sector, know that can be achieved. These things can be achieved. Not necessarily every single one of them for every single client, but that's, there's going to be some that are more important for some than others. Lovely. And so, very, very lightly, just to re-highlight, so why can exercise and physical activity help to prevent disease and then even potentially manage the progression of the condition itself? And it's because it helps to increase that cerebral blood flow, get that oxygen and nutrients to the brain, stimulates brain cell growth and survival, as opposed to allowing inflammation to develop, which in turn actually just kills off cells through the inflammatory process. And it can reduce the likelihood of those other comorbidities. And we know that heart disease and diabetes are strongly linked, and there is evidence to show that those living with those two conditions could well be at higher risk of dementia too. So it's all about balancing out the body's responses ultimately, and exercise nearly always has a protective effect. So let's have a look at what our exercise objectives are going to be with these individuals. We want to improve quality of life. We want to, where possible, increase balance and coordination. And we will talk about the goals for different stages of Alzheimer's shortly. We want to improve social interaction. And we definitely want to increase muscular strength, particularly now with all the deconditioning as a result of COVID, and decrease the risk of our other medical conditions. So with those objectives in mind, hopefully you'd be able to determine, in whatever background you're from, a helpful and effective way to work towards those. So let's, I'll just turn off my camera again so you can see my slides fully. What kind of exercise do we need? Well, really anything that moves the body is going to be seen as beneficial. However, if we're looking at evidenced types of exercise prescription, then of course we want to integrate balance, we want to increase coordination, and then we want to develop our aerobic system and our strength as well. If you were to look at the guidelines for older adults, so people over 65, I don't know if you are aware of them already, they will say you need to do 150 minutes of aerobic exercise over a week at a moderate level of intensity, or 75 minutes at a vigorous level of intensity, and you need to integrate balance and coordination activities twice a week and strength twice a week. So really, if you had that in mind, although that's probably very overwhelming and not achievable initially for those that haven't been active for a long period of time with this condition, it is something to try and work towards. And everything is relative, so moderate to one person is something different to somebody else. So it's not like we need everybody huffing and puffing. We just need people to challenge their bodies above and beyond what it's currently used to in order to see improvements. So we want to get a combination of these exercises in, which can be done through chair exercise as well as standing forms of exercise too. And of course, so much of research looks at walking and how it can help, well, nearly every element of our physiology. Somewhere along the line, you'll find a scientific study that's looked at whether walking is beneficial at controlling it. There's even studies at the moment looking at how can we control the pathophysiology of Alzheimer's through activity in terms of the proteins. We talked about amyloid protein and tau building up within the neurons and around it. Can physical activity slow that down? Can physical activity stop that from happening in the first place? And also, are there drugs that can do that? So it's very much a field that's always being investigated, but walking will always come up in the science there. And dance is highlighted because with this demographic, people like music. Music is great to relate to. Dance is fun and expressive. And I mean, right now, our people that are probably 70, 80, 90 years of age will have enjoyed dancing as a form of recreation in their younger years. And so it will be something that they very much relate to, remember, and like to reminisce around. So if you can get someone to really engage with a form of exercise like that, then you're going to have them participate for longer and in turn get more significant benefits. But all of the exercises need to be functional. So if you're thinking about individual exercises that you can put in, you need to also think about the associated task that they could help someone with. So anything that works on grip function, like squeezing balls, will help with opening jars and gripping objects, and anything that's involving standing up from a chair and controlling it down, of course, will help people with standing up from a chair, getting in and out of a car and moving around. So thinking back to the real need for it to apply to that person's activities of daily living. And whilst we all have a lot of the same activities of daily living for getting ourselves ready and just moving in a given day, there'll also be some people that have other activities they enjoy doing during a given day that maybe the next person that you're working with doesn't have. So you need to make sure that you're tailoring those exercises to them. For example, if someone really used to like golf, let's say, then you really want to try and find a way to mimic movements and actions and thought processes related to that. And the same for, say, gardening. Okay, so I took this from the Alzheimer's Society. And I think it's great. I just really like this acronym. We want to make sure that exercise is pleasant. So if it's pleasant, then it's pleasurable. It's something that people actually want to engage in and that they would enjoy it. We want to make it something that they liked in the past. And this is really quite huge if you can integrate this, because if you can really tap into memories of what they used to enjoy and things that they associate as being positive, then you're going to engage them again. It can't always be done. It can't always be something that we liked in the past, in which case you need to focus on the other letters within this acronym more significantly. So E, we need to make it easy to perform. It needs to be something that is within their current skill set, within, you're not advancing them too quickly. Now, whilst I think it's important to challenge the brain and to not take it too easy on those maybe with milder dementia symptoms, we want to make sure that we do ease people into activity. So ensure that it is easy to perform and achievable for them to begin with. Otherwise, you're only going to instill a sensation of failure and I'm unable to do it, or I don't want to do it. So we want to make sure that it's achievable. But A is make it appropriate to their level of ability and the type of dementia that they have. Reflecting back on those symptoms that I talked about a little while ago, some people's initial symptoms were that they forget, they can't keep it in their short-term memory, whilst others are just slower in their thought process and remembering. Depending on the symptoms that individual is presenting, you are going to adapt how you instruct and what you encourage them to do. I always used to say to my groups when they said to me, are you expecting me to remember how to do this next week? And I was like, absolutely not, because if you do, I don't have a job and I really want to come back next week. So it's all about making sure that you kind of keep it lighthearted and make sure that they feel it's appropriate to them right there and that they're going to be supported throughout it. So of course, S is then make it safe. So important when we've got people that could be at a higher risk of falls in particular. And if people are unable to make themselves familiar with an environment or remember an activity, then it's going to be even more important to make sure that we are instructing it time after time safely, because they're learning it new each time that they are there. Make it aerobic. So really do challenge the cardiovascular system. Whilst we are talking now post-COVID about focusing on strength and mobility first, we still ultimately want to be able to get that cardiovascular demand. We want to reach a level of what we call overload in fitness, which sounds horrendous, but it just means that we are pushing the body above and beyond what it's used to, so we see developments, because we don't want to stay static. We want to improve areas of the body so that we can increase that quality of life, maintain that independence, and ultimately slow down the disease's progression where possible. Then we've got N, so make it involve noise. And I think probably a lot of you here, especially those of you with an understanding of dementia already, will know that music, talking, sounds. So I'm going to combine N and T here, make it have noise and make it involve touching and sensory receptors, basically. Anything that really stimulates the senses is important. It's great. Throwing and catching balls, squeezing things, using different style instruments, having music on in the background that they can relate to, that they will remember, will be amazing. I remember in one of my classes, I had a guest Tai Chi instructor come in to do a seated session for me. And I had a gentleman with vascular dementia and was moderate to severe in his symptoms. But each week I worked with him and he was great. But his wife was very much like, he can't do it. He shouldn't be here. He won't be able to participate in this session. I just won't bring him. And I said, please bring him. If he can't do it, then I'll adapt for him. And I remember sitting next to him thinking, right, let's see how this goes, because I'm not that familiar with Tai Chi myself and I was about to participate. I'll just turn on my camera here. Oh, sorry, went forwards. And what happened was the Tai Chi guy turned on his music, which was clearly this guy's ultimate music. And I just saw a light in his eyes and he was just like, wow. And he performed every movement in that session better than me. And I was just absolutely blown away. I knew exercise was great. I knew music was engaging and stimulating. But seeing that form of music that guy, that Tai Chi instructor used, light this guy up, and his wife was like absolutely gobsmacked. And whilst that's not necessarily going to happen for every single person, if you can get some sort of a reminiscing type of environment, it will really, really, really make a difference to the enjoyment factor and the success of the overall session. So I'll touch back on a little bit of these in a little while when we're just going to go through some of the exercise prescriptions. Now, I just turned my camera off again, sorry. What I want to highlight here is this is a table from Perrin and May, and they created in this document a dementia journey, which matched the stages of the condition to the abilities and the suitable activities for people. So, of course, on the left, we've got our early dementia and then through to our late stages of dementia. And then at the bottom, we've got a couple of rows there that say exercise and then sort of music. And what our primary focus is going to be in the early stages of dementia is trying to actually create some structure in an exercise session that has specific outcomes. So trying to improve balance, trying to improve strength, and try and, challenge the system, really try and make sure that people are using their arms and their legs together where possible, and not be too scared of not, of overdoing it. So of course we want to progress people into it. As I said before, you don't want to make it unachievable for them, but you want to make sure that over that period of time that you're working with them, you have intentional outcomes that you're trying to achieve, because this is how we stimulate things in the body and how we can potentially decrease the disease's progression. However, as people progress, or maybe as you then have clients and patients that come to you with middle to later stages of dementia, our shift of attention is going to focus a bit more towards falls prevention movements and ensuring that we have integrated things that will support them with their activities of daily living most fundamentally. So ankle mobility and stretching, walking gait, so using the hips and making sure that we are using the upper body in the same way that we would everyday life, and of course the same for the lower body. But that's how our attention is shifting from having the very specific improvements in strength to actually, is it going to help prevent the risk of falls and help them with everyday life? And as you move through to the late stages of dementia, our focus is going to be more around just movement, circulation. So that often involves people having music on, for example, and just moving the body in whatever way is right, flowing with the movement, and nothing too prescriptive, nothing too rigid. It's quite an open form of movement. And at the bottom row there, you can see we've got dance music, so more, maybe a bit more intentional to move to it at a quicker pace, and then obviously using it more for a form of release and calm and just general flow. So this I think is a great table. If you haven't seen this before, I have actually put the recommend reading on the last slide. So when they share the slides with you, you can just literally Google the titles and get 3 documents by these authors that are really helpful. When we talk now again about COVID-19 and its impact on cognition, where we might have had somebody before March last year who was considered early dementia, they might be experiencing symptoms that are moving them further down the scale in terms of mid symptoms. So although that might be more environmental related and they can improve with being able to go back to their routine, we still need to think about how we structure our session. So easing people back into it, ultimately thinking about starting gradual and then maybe moving back to having those specific outcomes if that's right for that person. Whilst others may have regressed in this year, and that's going to be where they are, it's about ensuring that we understand that and adapt accordingly. And particularly for those that might have, say, worked with clients, like one client before and haven't seen them for a while, don't return obviously with the expectation that they can do what they were doing before. And then those that don't currently have that diagnosis but are maybe experiencing cognitive impairments as a result of having COVID itself, they may well then find that you may well find that they're going to benefit better from you taking strategies and ideas of exercise from this sort of middle ground section, and then build on that over time as their symptoms hopefully diminish. So really thinking about how it impacts both those with and without cognitive impairments. So ACSM is the American College of Sports Medicine, and in the fitness sector, and I appreciate you're not all from the fitness sector, we use them as sort of our guidelines for many, many things. Now, whilst they don't have very defined guidelines necessarily for dementia, they do state that enjoyment and maintenance of function are the key things that we need to achieve. And to achieve those, then we need to make sure we integrate these things that we've already discussed. So this is more of us channeling down and highlighting what we do want the exercise content to be. So when we work with individuals with any form of cognitive impairment, we want to make sure that we use both visual and auditory clues. So we want to demonstrate movements, and we are most likely to have to do that more than once. along with verbal cues. Now, verbal cues need to be non-technical. It definitely needs to be focused around what the movement actually requires of the body, or better still, what it mimics that people might understand. So for example, if I was going to get you to I'm just going to put my row your arms forwards and backwards like this, squeezing your shoulder blades, which is great for improving posture and bringing our shoulders back and down. Whilst I might say to somebody without a cognitive impairment, let's row our arms forwards and back, squeeze our shoulder blades together. For someone with dementia, I would maybe actually even say, let's pretend that we're rowing a boat, rowing the arms forwards and backwards. And then later stages, actually song and engagement like that is actually very effective. So you might even sing the song, row, row, row your boat. But it has to be right, of course, for that person and the stage of their cognitive development and what they enjoy. So in combining those visual and demonstrating and verbal cues. The session duration is going to have to start off maybe shorter, so 15 to 20 minutes and building up to 45 minutes and maybe even longer. If you remember, I said the older adult guidelines, so people over 65 should be doing 150 minutes of exercise across the week. So that's going to take a bit of getting to, and it's not going to be achievable for everyone, of course. We just need to bear in mind like what is okay to start with and see how the body and how the person reacts, knowing that each week or each session things could be different. You know, people don't necessarily react the same way in every single session with these types of cognitive conditions. So improved dexterity and hand-to-eye coordination. So your simplest of movements, doing making sure that you put your thumb on your little finger and then seeing if you can tap each of your fingers. Wiggling the fingers around, wiggling your toes, and then hand-to-eye coordination activities. So like we said about throwing and catching, using arms and legs at the same time. Oh, there's so many different ways. At the moment, we're training locally. We've got a big project for care home staff, and we're training them in chair-based exercise. And of course, a lot of them have residents that are living with dementia. So there's a lot of discussion about what they think is achievable from what obviously we're teaching, as well as all the adaptations that we're talking about. And it's really fun to learn from different people what thoughts, what creative ways they've got about moving people. So if you are someone that's going to then start doing exercise, or you do currently, it's always good to pair up with somebody else and just have a little bit of a mind map session of what movements do you do and what things do you do, because you learn so much from each other. But yeah, some great ways that you can improve dexterity with fun games that are social, make it enjoyable and everything like that. So, and then again, make sure you've got your balance exercises in there. Definitely harder to achieve for those with the moderate to severe dementia, because you've got that greater risk of falls. But if you are working one-on-one, then you can still do it. And of course, just make sure you're really thinking about your safety. And like I say, combine those arms and legs for both the dexterity, both the coordination element, but also because it increases the cardiovascular impact of that exercise. So it will strengthen the cardiorespiratory system as well as the muscular system by combining the two together. But if you've got your lower level clients, always start with one set of extremities at a time. So normally your legs, and then you build up to your arms, and then you put the two together. Okay, let me just see. We've got, I'm covering with my camera there. Stimulating the senses with bright colors and sounds, as I said before. And that can be anything from you as the person wearing bright colored clothing, them wearing bright colored clothing, using equipment that is different colors, make sounds like balls with bells in, things that have different textures, so smooth and rough. And like we said about different forms of music. And if your people are still at the mild end of the spectrum and you are challenging, you can get them to use both verbal discussions, so might say someone's name as well as performing an exercise at the same time. That is very challenging, as you can imagine, and great to put in there if you feel it is appropriate for your group. Okay. So last few slides and then I'm done. So communication, so important. We might well know everything that there is to know about dementia and have a really great detailed understanding of how it physiologically affects the body. But if at the end of the day we can't communicate with someone living with that condition, then it's going to help nobody ultimately. So we need to think about, how do we put this information across and actually help to engage this demographic? So remember, 80% of communication is non-verbal. It's your body language, it's what you do, it's how you come across. So having open, positive body language, you move clearly and concisely when you demonstrate, is going to be very, very helpful. Manual guidance and demonstrations, of course, are very beneficial. Depends on your sector right now, but with COVID, obviously we've had a lot of limitations with the whole 2-meter spacing, hence why it's been very challenging to work with those that need more specific help. But if you work in a care sector or with people that you're allowed to get closer to, manual guidance is likely to be needed just to help them learn how to sit well, how to move well, so that they don't hurt themselves. And again, reinforcing that with regular demonstrations. Make sure that you cue your activities. So that might be with your hands. That might also be verbal cueing, so that people know when they're changing. Yeah, think about your representation of just yourself, like how you sit, how you come across, and how you talk. If you're not engaged and you're just there to do a job that you don't enjoy doing, then that's going to come off. But if you enjoy it, then it will come through to those individuals, and in turn, hopefully create a level of enjoyment and excitement within their session too. Think about the speed of body or limb movements. That's mostly focused on your demonstrations, because if you're quite a fit and able person and you're demonstrating, say, marching on a chair, you can very easily find yourself marching a lot quicker than what those in front of you can follow along with. So think about making sure that you don't create a level of overwhelm by accident, just because you're able to. So think about that, and then think obviously about the safety of them moving their extremities for balance and injury prevention. Use eye-to-eye contact with all forms of effective communication. Eye-to-eye contact is essential, and your facial expressions too. Another thing I just want to add on to the end of that with communication is, if you're working with individuals that haven't exercised for a very long time, explaining to them about what you're going to do and how their body might feel after the session is very important, because people might ache. If they're using muscles that they haven't used for a long time, they're likely to experience some sensations that they haven't had. And that can scare some individuals, and we definitely don't want that. I remember in one care home that our local group went to, we were integrating some chair exercise and various things, including table tennis. And one of the gentlemen there was about 80, started playing table tennis because he hadn't played in years and absolutely loved it. So he played for about 3 hours. And no one mentioned to him on that day, the table tennis people, that he might ache. And then the next day he ate, surprisingly. And wouldn't come out of his room any time that the activity people attended again, which was really, really sad considering how enjoyable he found that first session. So it's minimizing those potential problems by making sure that you fully communicate, and that might mean saying it at the start of each session too, or reinforcing or checking in on people after their session as well. Okay, so to bring this to a close, the summary points I highlighted in this quick session today were that dementia is an umbrella term for different diseases of the brain, Alzheimer's being the most common form. Numerous studies support exercise and physical activity as a way to reduce the risk, but also help manage the condition. Exercise must be client-centered and individualized if you want it to be successful. Exercise must be, got that twice. Use large muscle groups and simple movements. Encourage the use of different senses where possible. Remember, each day they see you, they may be experiencing different levels of their symptoms. So whether that's their mental well-being or their physical ability, you will need to have adaptations up your sleeve so that you can adapt accordingly. And the main aim is to improve or maintain their independence for as long as possible. So as the new phrase for the activity recommendations goes, it's better to do something than nothing altogether, as long as that something is, of course, safe. So here were the documents I was making reference to that are pretty helpful for understanding the condition in relation to exercise. So when you receive the slides, then you could just literally put this into Google and you would be able to download these PDFs. Okay, that brings me to the end of my presentation today. So I'll hand back to whoever's doing the questions.
Thank you, Emma. That was really good, really useful. I believe Holly and Kelly, between you, are going to start asking the questions. Please, we've had a few questions in, so that's been really useful, and we'll kick off with those. If anyone's got any other questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and we will try to get through as many as we can. Holly, did you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. I guess there's a kind of two parts to this question. It's around kind of that returning to seeing clients, potentially could be new or people that you've seen before. And you mentioned kind of early on in the presentation around that kind of drop in diagnosis and potentially that misdiagnosis, and just an understanding of, as instructors or people are starting to see their regular clients again, what kind of things do they need to take into consideration, look out for, and as a result, if they notice anything, what do they need to action to support those people if they maybe haven't thought about, actually this could be a symptom and I need to maybe get it checked?
Yeah, okay, that's a really good question. So what I wanted to mention, actually, so I can do that now, is if you haven't seen, there is return to exercise guidance available from the British Journal of Sports Medicine. And again, if you just type into Google return to exercise after COVID, then you'll get the full journal. And then there's also a blog version, which kind of makes it a little easier to understand. And they've got like a 5-stage approach to easing people back into activity, particularly obviously following a diagnosis of COVID. So just do that one first. If someone's had COVID and we want to reintroduce them back to activity, whether they have dementia or not, it is going to be a definite screening situation. You need to make sure that they have had symptoms or they've been symptomless for at least 2 weeks. And if they've got other chronic health conditions, then obviously you need to use common sense, use the guidelines as well, and make sure that you screen accordingly. It is suggested that anyone with complicated symptoms, like they've had a severe case of COVID-19 or they have dementia and had COVID-19, that will have potentially moved around the body and had a bigger impact on maybe their central nervous system as well as other organs, that they should probably speak to somebody before returning back to exercise, whether that is their dementia nurse, a GP if they can get an appointment, hopefully they can, or a physiotherapist, occupational therapist, anyone that might be in their lives, just to get that reassurance. Now, whilst I mentioned to the team, I asked Dr. William Bird whether people that have had COVID should get medical clearance. He said not everybody that's had COVID, but if someone is experiencing long COVID symptoms, which could of course include that cognitive decline I was mentioning, then I think it's good practice just to be sure and be safe, whilst balancing out the fact that we don't want to unnecessarily send people there. For those living with dementia, returning back to exercise, say away from the fact that say they haven't had COVID, then I think what you need to do is you just need to find out what they've been doing, what they can currently do for themselves, like where their activities of daily living lie. As I know, a lot of people have found themselves unable to get out of a chair now, where before it wasn't really a problem for them. And you've got to use those kind of screening questions and discussions and almost kind of assessment tools to work out where your baseline is going to be from where you start from. And you'll also get through conversation just where they are mentally. So if they have been very low or if they've been feeling very agitated and anxious about returning to exercise, then you can also balance out and pitch where you start your activity, i.e. mobility and gentle stretching and building things back up there. But if you look at the return to exercise, it talks about intensity and the types of exercise. So you'll need to combine those two together to make an informed judgment, I would say. But I think one of the hugest things that we're going to have to overcome is obviously anxiety around returning back to in-person exercise, and also people's ability and readiness to do that. So whilst we all might know activity is important for us, if I'm apprehensive about doing it, I need work on my I need support around helping change my mindset. So education on how it's going to help me, why it's important, how we can do it safely for me, etc. Around the actual practical, let's move you. It's going to need to be a more holistic approach to really get people through that sort of behavior change model, I think. Does that answer the question, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, there was a few questions just around if they noticed symptoms where someone wasn't experiencing those sort of a year
Right, okay, yes.
and kind of just that understanding of how they can support them. But maybe that's something I noticed that
I think,
from the Alzheimer's Society is we can answer that maybe aside.
Yeah, I think if you notice someone's starting to get forgetful or they are missing their sessions, I had this in the past when in exercise referral, people that have been with me like 6-7 years, and then they just started turning up like an hour later than class and things like that. You start to notice little patterns in their behavior. They're not dressed as well, they hadn't washed themselves, or they hadn't cleaned their hair, little things like that because they've just been rushed and realized they needed to leave. It is a case of just encouraging them to speak to their doctor. And if you really can't get in with doctors at the moment, I'm saying to people, head to a pharmacist, because a pharmacist has an in, and if they feel appropriate, they will then call your GP, which, you know, because sometimes it's quite challenging to kind of get past the receptionist in some GP practices. So don't forget that you've got pharmacists that's mostly helpful as well.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. Another question was, you kind of touched on a few things around, like if there's a black floor in the entrance, is there any practical examples that you've got around making adaptations to spaces to make them feel safer for people?
So it's hard because obviously a space is a space and you're not an interior designer most of the time. So thinking about the space that you have and trying to make it, like basically choosing an appropriate space really is all you have within your control, significantly. So generally rooms that relate to comfortable areas are seen as good places to be. So if that's someone's lounge, or whether it's a communal area, is like maybe in a residential home, etc., is generally a nicer space than maybe a more formal studio, and certainly gyms where there's lots of people coming and going. In community halls, it sounds simple, but things that make that calming environment are plants and lighting. So not harsh lighting, seeing if you can control that, maybe with blinds and things, and just making the space look more familiar, you know, rather than a very formal commercial or very fitness orientated space. Think about making it similar to what they're used to. I would be more comfortable exercising in my lounge compared to going into any sort of busy space, whether that was in or outside of a leisure centre, for example. So think about what they currently feel is right for them, what they like to do, where they like to go, and try and mimic as much of that as possible. But lighting generally, sound and noise, making sure it's not busy, bustling background, temperature, making sure it's a warmer temperature. Generally, all these things add to a nicer environment to walk into. And then, of course, as the instructor, you are the link between them walking in that room and staying in that room and feeling comfortable being there. So then, you know, appreciating that kind of thing. And nice touches like tea and coffee at the side, whilst I don't advocate chocolate biscuits to everybody, but they seem to have them even in cardiac rehab. You know, little touches like that make it enjoyable for them, because they're like, well, I'm going to get a cup of tea afterwards. So I think that's as much as I could probably share, whether maybe Alzheimer's Society and people like that have the very specific experience of in things that, like I said, about the floor and whatever, they might have adaptations with that they know of, but I don't really.
That's great, thank you. Yeah, we can put some questions and answers onto the website around that. So yeah, I guess last one from me. There's been a few questions just around managing a class with different severities of dementia, and just any experiences or support that you can offer for that.
Yeah, so it can be really tricky, and I think what needs to be done is you need to manage the number of people to the number of instructors. So if it's just you, I'm afraid you do need to think about, even though say 20 people want to be there, you probably need to have multiple sessions rather than try and fit that 20 people in, because you're not going to get that rapport, and you're definitely not going to be able to split yourself and support all of those individuals, particularly if they have different levels of disease severity. Now, as people have moderate to severe stages, it's likely that they're going to come with somebody that supports them anyway. So that might be a spouse or family member, or it might be a carer. And it's almost recommended, to be honest, because they'll have that confident, that familiar person next to them, which is helpful, but you have a second pair of hands. So as a freelance instructor myself, that's what we would have asked people to do, but it happened naturally anyway. Those that weren't able to get themselves independently to a session, like drive themselves there or walk there, they came with somebody and that person stayed anyway. So we got them involved and they sat there and they participated and they were that extra support. So that is ultimately what I would say to do. And if you really didn't have that capacity, say, well, I mean, even in care homes, I know people generally double team up with sessions, so there's 2 of them. You would need to make sure that obviously you are closer to those that needed more support, so that you could, if you were doing chair exercise, let's say, stand up and support them. And then obviously those that just a little bit further away, no one should be too far away, but you just have that ability to move around the room effectively towards those that need more support. But definitely not doing it on your own, I think, is actually what you'll probably find is the safest, sensible and most effective way of running a session for this demographic.
That's great, thank you. Kelly, were there any more questions that have come in since I've been chatting?
Thanks, Holly. There was a question around, are there any nationally recognised exercise programmes specifically looking to support those with dementia? And actually, last week we did a webinar for the prevention and enablement model, which is a pilot that we're running in Essex. And an organisation called Sport for Confidence are rolling out Love to Move initiative in areas of Basildon. Is this something that you've come across, Emma, as sort of a best practice example?
Well, if so I interpreted the question to be, is there like training that you can get specifically in that? And in terms of like recognised qualifications or reputable training for full qualifications, the only company I can think of is Later Life Training, who do like workshops and sort of short courses on this particular topic. And then, yeah, you've obviously said an example of initial pilots that have happened there. We've had similar pilots that have run out around here, but otherwise there isn't anything too standardized, and that's what I think is missing, and probably will get filled really realistically quite quickly, given the fact that with COVID we've had such a decline in cognitive function and mental conditions. Other than that training provider and what you've just said, I don't really know of too many others, but I will have a look, and like we said, we can maybe add it to the follow-up email if we can find anything more specific.
That's great. Thanks, Emma. I think just one final question then, if that's okay. So we've had a question come in around what do you do if a parent is displaying some mild symptoms of the disease, and actually being able to talk to them without scaring them, it can be really, really scary for individuals, particularly if they have some knowledge around dementia anyway. So, are there some practical examples that we can give to people to have those conversations with their loved ones?
There is definite supporting information for that, and full documents that you can download from the charity websites that will go into a lot more detail in terms of how to open that up. But as you probably experience in general life, sometimes that harder and closer to home stuff is hard to come from a loved one directly. So sometimes it needs to be instigated from either a health professional or someone else that's not quite, like, it's close but not quite that son, daughter, etc. I think I know from my experience, all the people that have been diagnosed around me, whether that's family related or external participants that I've worked with, they've all had to say to that person at some stage, I'm concerned about a couple of the symptoms that you have, and I'd like you to speak to somebody about it, because what you don't want to do is come across that you're all knowing and you're diagnosing them with a condition they probably don't want to hear about. So it's more of a case of concern and trying to approach it from the point of view, let's see what we can do to stop this becoming, I know it's going to progressively go somewhere, but right now we want to manage it so that it doesn't impact sort of the current lifestyle. But the whole, like, the way that you speak to people, particularly loved ones, it's there's a lot of support on those two, like Alzheimer's Society website and Dementia UK. So again, like, I can grab those links. I couldn't dictate like all of that, I'm afraid, to you, but there's definite resources there that are very, very good.
Yeah, I just noticed in the chat on that question that there is the Alzheimer's Society have put their helpline number in. So
exactly, the helpline. Yeah, I mean, absolutely amazing resource, isn't it, for literal answers for your exact situation. Yeah, that would be even better than reading the documents. Absolutely good idea.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm conscious of time. We've got a couple of minutes just to make sure we finish on time. So really, I just want to say a big thank you, Emma, for your delivery today. Lots of really positive comments and good feedback in the comment section. So again, thank you for that. As we said, we will try to get some links from the Alzheimer's Society, etc., and put those on our website, where we'll also host the recording of the video. So finally, just leaves me to say a big thank you for everyone that's attended today. As you leave the webinar, there will be a 3-question survey that will pop up hopefully on your screen. Please just take a couple of minutes. It's multiple choice, just to answer those questions. The first 2 will mimic the questions that we asked in the poll at the start of the webinar, and then there's one with some additional information around a more specific workshop on this. So finally, thank you, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon.